Hello, I'm Knowlton Nash, and in this edition of News and Review, we report on a new approach at the United Nations on peacekeeping and intervention to save lives during civil war. We have a documentary on Canada's quintessential author, Margaret Atwood, on the release of her new novel, The Blind Assassin. And we look back at the Sydney Olympics, which was successful as the world's leading athletic event, but was plagued by drug abuse, and for Canada, a less than expected performance. It was the first time ever that so many world leaders had gathered in one place. The place was New York. They came from Afghanistan and Zimbabwe, from tiny Togo, and from the world's last superpower, the United States. They numbered more than 150. Their numbers included kings, princes, prime ministers, and presidents. And they were all in town for the United Nations Millennium Summit. The leaders talked about the issues facing the world at the start of the millennium, and the one they identified as the biggest was making the world a safer place. Peacekeeping has always been a critical part of the United Nations mandate. The preamble of the UN Charter makes that quite clear: to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And Article 1 of the Charter says one of the main functions of the UN is to maintain international peace and security, and to that end to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to peace, to suppress acts of aggression or other breaches of the peace, and to bring about adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of the peace. Soon after the Charter was signed in San Francisco in 1945, those lofty principles were put to the test. Newly independent India and Pakistan went to war over Kashmir. The Security Council called a ceasefire in 1948 and sent in military observers. And even in those early days, Canada was there with 8 observers. Soon, UN observers were also deployed along Arab-Israeli borders in the Middle East. The observers were just that, observers. They kept an eye on military movements and watched over the civilians living in the area. They managed to calm things down, but there was no lasting peace. The UN's response to the Korean crisis in 1950 was quite different. It authorized what was called a police action led by the United States to resist North Korea's invasion of the South. This wasn't an observer mission. It was all-out war. Canada's reputation as one of the world's most active international peacekeepers was made after the crisis over the Suez Canal in 1956. Egypt nationalized the canal, joining the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. It also cut off Israeli access to the Red Sea. Britain and France were worried about oil shipments to Europe being blocked, and they joined Israel in attacking Egypt. Lester B. Pearson was then Canada's Secretary of State for External Affairs. He helped negotiate an end to that confrontation, and he helped to create a peacekeeping force to stabilize the region, a peacekeeping force with a large Canadian contingent. That effort won Pearson the Nobel Peace Prize. Since then, the UN has been involved in dozens of peacekeeping operations around the world. During the early years, the UN managed to stop the fighting, but was not able to get long-term solutions. India and Pakistan have now fought 2 wars over Kashmir, and that area is still a military flashpoint. The Middle East is still groping for peace, and North and South Korea have just started taking baby steps towards sorting out their differences. The UN doesn't seem to have done much better in trying to settle more recent conflicts, most of them civil wars. It gave up on Somalia and beat a hasty retreat after small gangs of armed men repeatedly attacked its troops. In Rwanda, Canadian General Romeo Dallaire desperately pleaded for troops and arms to stop a massacre. Those pleas were ignored by the UN, and as many as 1 million people were slaughtered. The UN was humiliated in Bosnia when Serbs took its peacekeepers hostage and chained them to possible targets. And as UN observers watched, the Serbs slaughtered as many as 8,000 Muslims in Srebrenica, an area the United Nations had declared a safe zone. In Sierra Leone, rebels kidnapped hundreds of peacekeepers and held them hostage for a number of weeks. Yet the UN does have its successes. They include Mozambique, Nicaragua, and Cambodia. Even in Somalia, it averted a famine before it pulled its troops out. The problem that the UN faces is a lack of political commitment from its members to meet force with force. And the troops that countries send on these missions are often ill-trained and under-equipped. When the world's leaders came to New York, those were the problems they addressed. The CBC's Sasha Petrusek has that part of the story.
Behind blocked streets, well-armed police, and bomb barriers made of sand trucks, prime ministers, presidents, and kings came to make the globe a bit safer, the UN a little stronger.
We are here to strengthen and adapt this great institution, forged 55 years ago in the crucible of war, so that it can do what people expect of it in the new era, an era in which rule of law must prevail.
They promise specific commitments to reduce poverty and pollution, to improve peacekeeping.
Of course, some of the peacekeeping operations were not as successful as others, and it's good that they report on that and try to correct the mistakes that were committed.
We need UN units appropriate for more robust peacekeeping that can be inserted quickly.
Some promise a more active UN when countries violate human rights.
55 years ago, the UN was formed to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Today, there are more people in this room with the power to achieve that goal than have ever been gathered in one place. We find today fewer wars between nations, but more wars within them. Such internal conflicts, often driven by ethnic and religious differences, took 5 million lives in the last decade, most of them completely innocent victims. These conflicts present us with a stark challenge. Are they part of the scourge the UN was established to prevent? If so, we must respect sovereignty and territorial integrity, but still find a way to protect people as well as borders. The last century taught us that there are times when the international community must take a side, not merely stand between the sides or on the sidelines.
We want Khatami out of UN!
Outside the UN, Canadian student Shohreh Rezaei rails against human rights abuses in Iran.
The government in Iran is a terrorist dictator.
Now, if those inside accepted her complaints, would the UN have the right to send in troops? That's the issue that confronted leaders at the Security Council at this summit within a summit.
A crisis of credibility facing this council.
How to make UN peacekeeping more relevant. No one here disputes that mistakes have been made in places like Rwanda or Bosnia, where UN inaction led to ethnic bloodshed. But can the UN ignore a country's sovereignty and intervene to protect human rights?
Humanitarian principles and human rights must be given greater weight when the Council decides when to act.
Rightful concerns over sovereignty cannot allow us to turn a blind eye to the forces of evil.
The US, Britain, and France agree, but other powerful voices, voices with vetoes, do not. Here, China warned of grave consequences when so-called humanitarianism leads to the willful use of force.
Facts have proven that the success of the UN peacekeeping operations depends on the observance of the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, particularly the principles of respect for state sovereignty, non-interference in the internal affairs of the recipient country, seeking prior consent of the parties concerned, neutrality and non-use of force except for self-defense.
In the General Assembly later,
I am also pleased to announce that Canada,
Chrétien offered a solution.
Canada, with the support of interested foundations, is leading the establishment of an independent international commission on intervention and state sovereignty. Our foreign minister will shortly outline the rationale and mandate of the commission.
Its job will be to write rules on when the UN can send in soldiers to fight abuses. Many observers say that's futile, since every situation is so different. But even critics say Canada's plan may just open up more dialogue on much-needed changes to UN peacekeeping. The Canadian who organized this huge summit says at the very least this should give people global standards to judge their leaders by.
civil society, you people from the press, the voters, the electors, have a benchmark which they can present to leaders and say, yeah, but you've agreed to do that. What have you done?
We have to expect Canadian leaders on foreign policy issues to get Canada's act together on whether or not we are going to depart in a serious way from our former tradition of only being involved in peacekeeping where the parties themselves have the will to invite Canadian peacekeepers on behalf of the UN to be part of some kind of solution. The standard that I would insist that Canadian politicians hold dear is to assume that violence is not, in many situations, if not most situations, a real solution to the problems that many assume it can solve. The record of violence actually making situations better is pretty weak. And part of the problem with the overfocus on state sovereignty as the reason we shouldn't be intervening in situations is that we forget that an equally important, if not more important reason, is that we should be avoiding at all costs the use of violence in international relations as some kind of solution to some of the problems we're facing.